Hey there, everybody. I'm John Harwood in Washington, and this is the New York Times Special Edition. This hour, we're going to tell you whether those stress tests really did produce good news, especially since we also learned today that unemployment keeps going up. And on our caucus roundtable, the smartest from the New York Times will answer the question, will Afghanistan become Barack Obama's Iraq? And how bold might Obama be with his Supreme Court pick? Also, we'll have a Times exclusive video from behind the scenes as photographers rush into the Oval Office for a shot at the president. Now, we begin with the new jobless numbers out today that both MSNBC and the New York Times have been reporting on. More than 500,000 jobs were shed last month. While that's a stunning number, the pace of job losses is starting to level off.
Although we have a long way to go before we can put this recession behind us, the gears of our economic engine do appear to be slowly turning once again.
Now, since the recession began, the economy's lost 5.7 million jobs. The unemployment rate now stands at 8.9%. That's up from 4.9% in January of last year. Austin Goolsbee is a member of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He joins us now from the White House. Austin, these numbers are not good at all, even though you had some positive news from the stress tests yesterday. Can you explain to Americans out there why it is that if the economy is getting better, unemployment keeps going up?
Well, look, you're right. The job report was basically bad. The only good news in it is that it's a better report than we've gotten the last several months. I think the basic answer to your question is we're just starting to turn the economy around, and the job market responds slower than the rest of the economy. So you got to get things going in the economy before you can start creating jobs and start getting actually positive reports as opposed to reports that aren't as bad as they could have been or as were expected.
Well, so it's 8.9% now. It's going to keep rising by your account and by that of other economists I talked to. How high is it going to get? Is it going to hit 10%?
I don't know. I hope not. And the good news is we've just started putting the $787 billion recovery package into the system. The tax cuts going out starting in April, so they've been going out for about a month. There are a number of people who believe that the first bit of this stimulus may partly be an explanation of why the numbers came in better than were expected. And so we're hoping that as the real serious money of that thing starts getting into the system, that we could keep unemployment from getting, really substantially higher. But I don't think there's any question for a few months it's going to go up.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I talked this morning to Mark Zandi, who I know that you also know, a very well-respected economist. Yeah. He said it will hit 10%. The stimulus that's been passed is not enough, and it will probably be advisable next year to pass an additional stimulus measure. Are you guys prepared to ask Congress for that if, in fact, unemployment does keep rising?
Well, look, I respect Mark Zandi a lot. I hope he's wrong. This stimulus, it's way, way premature to be talking about a second stimulus. As I say, we've just started the first bit of the money out of the biggest stimulus of all times. So it strikes me as way ahead of the game to be talking about needing another one. Let's get this one into the system as quick as we can.
But, Austin, won't it be tough for you guys over the next several months, especially as Democrats begin to face the voters in 2010, to do nothing in terms of additional stimulus if, in fact, unemployment does keep going up?
Well, look, I would not describe putting $787 billion into the system as doing nothing. You're saying if we weren't doing anything, I think the American people would rightfully be upset. But they're going to see, billions and billions of dollars of additional programs and additional injections coming into the system over the next 18 months. And I think it's going to make a big difference. Now, that doesn't mean we've got to be pushing on all fronts. The president's tried to have a small business lending facility. You've got the banks. We're trying to turn around that situation, and we release these bank examinations, which say maybe the hole is not as big as some of the biggest pessimists had feared. And if you approach it on all of those fronts, hopefully we can get the job market start turning around the way the rest of the economy has.
Well, let's see, Austin. We'll hope that Mark Zandi is wrong, although I've got to say he's been right about a lot over the last couple of years. Austin Goolsbee, thanks for joining us at the White House.
Great to see you again, John.
Now, aside from the economy, what else is ahead for the White House? So many other big issues sitting on the president's plate legislatively. Jeff Zeleny is the White House correspondent for the New York Times. He joins us live in the studio. Jeff, first of all, how optimistic is the White House and how concerned are they? I think you saw some of that reflected in Barack Obama's comments today about the fact that even while they say things are getting better, unemployment's not.
And they are very worried about that. There's no question that one thing, as each month goes on, this becomes President Obama's problem. They talk a lot about, the situation they inherited. You didn't hear that much from President Obama this morning. He's talking about retraining workers and other things. So you're not hearing as many sort of, give us time, although Austin was asking for a bit of patience. But they're concerned that, they're going to have to do something else, probably before Congress leaves Washington, or something, where these numbers will continue to get worse. But more importantly, the legislative agenda is coming up here, that they need to start making some headway on health care, on energy independence, if they're going to do those things. We're almost halfway through the year.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if progress on those fronts, especially expanding health care coverage, might deal with some of that discontent from people. But I was talking yesterday to Vin Weber, former congressman, very well known around town, who said that if we get a setback in the economy, if something turns down, then Barack Obama is going to be seen to own this economy and is going to face a lot of pressure from Democrats to act. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And already beginning next week and the week after, President Obama is going to be starting to do some fundraisers for some Democrats. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is one of the first. And this signals the beginning of re-election season in 2010. So time is really short here. And he will own this problem more than he does already. And boy, if that unemployment rate goes over 10% or even hits 10%, it's a problem for Democrats in the midterms.
A lot of criticism of the administration early on when Tim Geithner came out with his plan for distressed assets at the banks and the stock market went down. Different story this time. The market responded positively. How's the White House feeling about how Tim Geithner performed and how, in general, they've handled this stress test issue?
The White House feels pretty good about how this has turned out. They probably could have never predicted this. Boy, when this first began, when they announced that they were going to go through this in February, I believe it was, they weren't sure how this movie would end necessarily.
Some of the officials told me they thought the market was going to go down when the stress test results came in.
And yesterday the results were pretty overwhelmingly positive, much more so than they thought. So there is some blue lining in this. I think they have more confidence in the Treasury Secretary, Tim Geithner, than really ever before during these first 4 months. They think he has a grasp of this. And the president, his confidence in him has never wavered. A lot of other people's did in the building, but they think this is working out about as good as it could have.
Let me ask you quickly about one other issue, and that's torture. We've had a flare-up of controversy lately about Nancy Pelosi. What did she know? She was asked by Rachel Maddow about this. Let's play that soundbite from Nancy Pelosi on torture.
They were talking about an array of interrogations that they might have at their disposal.
Techniques in the abstract, as if they were not being used.
We were never told they were being used.
Is this going to exacerbate pressure on the White House to come up with some sort of a torture commission? A Republican emailed me just before this show to say, well, maybe we should investigate members of Congress who knew about these events.
It sure could. We seem to learn just a little bit more every time we hear Speaker Pelosi speak. So I think this could certainly ratchet that up.
Jeff, we got to wrap it up here. We've got Drew Peterson now coming out of court. Live pictures from the Will County Courthouse in Joliet, Illinois. Legally, Drew Peterson must appear live in court to face the charges in connection with the death of his third wife, who was found dead in a bathtub. We'll have more on this coming up later. And now to some of the other stories breaking on the New York Times website right now. Massive wildfires near Santa Barbara, California. So far, at least 75 homes have been damaged, as many as 30,000 people evacuated. In Afghanistan, U.S. officials now admit that American bombs were partly responsible for at least 50 civilian deaths in western Afghanistan. Initial military reports suggested the casualty had come at the hands of Taliban grenades. Another story in the Times right now. Anti-Semitic ramblings from the man accused of killing a Wesleyan University student. Stephen Morgan was arraigned in Middletown, Connecticut a short time ago. NBC's Peter Alexander is there. Peter, police are talking about these entries in Morgan's diary. What do we know about them?
It's a good question, John. They found this journal at the crime scene not far from the Wesleyan campus where the victim in this crime was found. That is Johanna Justin Hinich. She was just 21 years old, a junior at Wesleyan. And in the journal entry that police say, according to an arrest warrant, was written by the suspect in this murder, 29-year-old Stephen Morgan. He wrote the following, quote, "I think it's okay to kill Jews and to go on a killing spree. Also, kill Johanna. Excuse me, she must die." That's the information that was in the arrest warrant. That now explains why yesterday the Jewish community had been told by police officials that they should also lock their doors. The synagogue here locking its doors yesterday. The school was in a lockdown. This all came to a head on Wednesday when the man, this suspect, allegedly walked into the school's off-campus bookstore, shooting Johanna Justin Hinich 7 times. John?
Wow, Peter, such a horrific story. Peter Alexander, thanks so much for being with us from Connecticut. And coming up, how dramatic of a move is President Obama willing to make when it comes to his Supreme Court pick? That's ahead with the caucus. And the Illinois police officer who gained national infamy after the death of his fourth wife is now arrested, as you just saw in those pictures. NBC News is following more details ahead. Plus, how in trouble is the Republican Party? New York Times columnist Frank Rich says it's fallen apart. But that's actually bad for the president. He joins me coming up in this New York Times special edition, only on MSNBC. Okay, so if the Republican Party does fall apart, some say it's happening already, would that be a good thing for the president? Would it really make his life any easier? Frank Rich of the New York Times doesn't think so. We'll talk to that influential columnist in just a few minutes. But first, the challenges ahead next week begin with the big headlines this week. There's the President's Oval Office meetings with the leaders of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Teen mom Bristol Palin becomes the spokesperson for abstinence. And Elizabeth Edwards releases her memoirs airing all her husband's dirty secrets. Joining us now is Sam Tannenhouse, editor of the Weekend Review and the Book Review for the New York Times. Sam, what you got on the cover this week?
Hey, John, how you doing? Well, we're going to address all those issues. Alessandra Stanley has written a great story for us that's going to look at sex and politics. She's going to go global. So we'll see the Berlusconis as well as the Edwardses and the Palins and see how sex and politics are handled differently, Europe versus the United States. Philip Taubman, remember Washington bureau chief of the paper, great foreign correspondent, has now written a story for us on no nukes, the zero nuclear option in an era when you've got a country like Pakistan with a lot of nukes and a lot of rogue elements who want them.
Sam, let me ask you about, since we're talking salacious with the Elizabeth Edwards and Bristol Palin and all that, we showed that video of Drew Peterson coming out of the courthouse a few minutes ago. I'm guessing you're not going to have anything about that case in your section, but tell me as an analyst of pop culture, what does it say that that's a huge story on television, but not a story for the New York Times?
Well, I mean, it's a tough question because you never know what it is a paper should be covering. The reason it's more interesting to us to look at a phenomena, and I use it in the plural, like Elizabeth Edwards and the Berlusconi family, the Palins, is because there you're talking about, yes, these possibly salacious matters that spill over into the public universe we all inhabit. It has to do with the kind of leaders we choose, the way we think of the life we share. When it is violence, brutality, murder, do we need to know about it? Sure. Do we think that it's of consequence in a sense that it needs to be mulled over and thought about? That's another question.
But you know what's so interesting about the piece that Alessandra is writing for you, because I heard you describing it this morning on Morning Joe, is that it's really talking about erasing that membrane between public and private. When exactly did that happen?
Well, that's a great question. And, Peggy Noonan was on that show with me and made a very important point. She said, most people still obey those differences. We're talking about people who were public in the first place. So if you take someone like Elizabeth Edwards, in a sense, her life has already been public. So since the knowledge people have of her life and career and marriage occurred in a public theater, well, then maybe that's where you bring closure to it as well. But one argument would be television changed all of that, erased the distinction between the private and the public. Certainly the internet and the kind of program we're doing now has made that membrane thinner, and it may be we're reaching a point where public and private will become meaningless terms, which is something you wonder about.
One of the things we speculate a lot when we get to these sort of pivotal moments in pop culture or in politics. I remember with the impeachment of Bill Clinton a few years ago, there was the question, okay, so are we going to back away? Are people going to decide all of this has gone too far? This Elizabeth Edwards stuff, it's to the edge of what I think of when I think of what's so painful about people to talk about themselves and their families. Do you see any turning away as a result of something that's so searing like this?
Well, it's a good question, John, because here we're seeing it from the reverse angle, as it were. It's not John Edwards coming before us as a nation and either asking for atonement or apologizing or not. This is actually the wronged woman, and the dynamic between her relationship, also, as we know, she's very ill and was really terminally ill at the time she agreed to be involved in the campaign. There's so much that, so many blurred lines now. It may be that we're always pushing into a new area, so you can't say we won't do it anymore because each new instance feels a little different from the last one.
Exactly. Sam, so many layers to that story. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure, John.
Now, new developments in the case of the former Chicago cop accused of killing his third wife. It's a story making news from coast to coast. We'll tell you what he said as he walked into court. A live report ahead. Plus, layoffs are hard on the people who lose their jobs, but also on their bosses. Surprise side effect of unemployment. And the New York Times wants to know how you are getting hurt by the economic downturn. What are your survival strategies? Go to nytimes.com, send in your thoughts, and we'll read some of the best of those later this hour. This is the New York Times Special Edition on MSNBC. Welcome back to the New York Times Special Edition here on MSNBC. Ahead this half hour, can President Barack Obama rest easy as the GOP struggles to find its way? Frank Rich of the New York Times says no. And signs of hope on Wall Street, even amid a weak jobs report. So have we turned a corner, in fact, on the economy? Plus, polar bear politics. How does the addition of the Arctic creature to the endangered species list impact the fight against global warming? Now, today we're introducing a new segment that we're calling Op Edge, bringing you the best of the New York Times columnists. First up is the GOP's uphill battle. Op-ed columnist Frank Rich writes, the Republican Party has collapsed, and that's not a good thing for the country or for Obama. We need more than one functioning party, not just to ensure checks and balances and pitch in ideas at times of crisis, but to temper this president's sporadic bursts of overconfidence and triumphalist stagecraft. Joining us now is Frank Rich from the New York Times newsroom in New York. Frank, tell me what you think are the effects of the president's overconfidence. Where do you see it, and what are the pitfalls of that?
Well, I think we're not seeing a lot of it yet. We saw some of it during the campaign. Remember that sort of faux presidential seal? I think we saw it a little bit at the inauguration when he sort of felt he could glide through Rick Warren doing the invocation and wouldn't have any problems with some groups in America, including gay people. But he's a confident guy, which is great. Sometimes he's maybe a little bit overconfident, and to me, the financial rescue, which still remains a mission to be accomplished, may be a place where it shows up.
Well, let me ask you about that, because that's topical, and your colleague Paul Krugman has made the argument that they're way too passive in terms of stimulus and bank regulation. Let me read you from his column the other day. President Obama and his economic advisors seem to have steered the economy away from the abyss, but the risk that America will turn into Japan and will face years of deflation and stagnation seems, if anything, to be rising. Are you worried about that they're simply not willing to be aggressive enough on the economy?
Yeah, I've felt that. I agree with Paul about much of that. I wouldn't make the prediction it's going to end up being like the lost decade in Japan. But that said, I always felt the stimulus could be bigger. I definitely felt that the bank program can be and should be more aggressive. And I feel, to get back to the confidence point, that the confidence that Obama has in this very smart team, many of whom were responsible for the crisis in the first place, may be misplaced. But we don't know yet. And it's hard to decipher really these stress tests, where it's going to lead and how conclusive they really are, or what it means.
Now, obviously, from your point of view, the flip side is that you think the Republicans are basically functioning like the Three Stooges right now. Tell me what you see What do you see from them? And if, in fact, the economy doesn't recover quickly, maybe their problems will take care of themselves because of weak economy, high unemployment, huh?
I guess it's possible that if the economy doesn't substantially improve by the next midterms, it would help the Republicans. But I don't see how a party that essentially appeals to rural white men, mainly in the South and a few other states, maybe a total of 10 states, can be a national party. I mean, when the party's biggest celebrities are the Palin family, the entire Palin family, sort of 8 is enough, I guess, of American politics, and Joe the plumber, and he's switching parties. Those are the dramas. That's the message.
You weren't impressed by the Mitt Romney-Jeb Bush coffee shop tour?
It looked like they were being held hostage in a strip mall. But also, it showed the problem. Look at that group. It's all white men. This is not America. If we learned anything from the last presidential
Eric Cantor is
election.
Jewish. Does that count?
No. And, you know, I think I'm glad, I say this as someone who is Jewish, that the Republican Party is welcoming Jews. But, by the way, they didn't even win the Jews in Florida, although they pretended they were going to right up until Election Day in November.
Frank Rich, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Good to talk to you.
Now, also in the Times, a piece about Sarah Palin's daughter, Bristol, an unwed teenage mother, becoming a spokesperson for an organization that promotes teen abstinence. Bristol Palin said, regardless of what I did personally, I just think that abstinence is the only 100% foolproof way to prevent pregnancy. New York Times columnist Gail Collins, Frank's colleague, questioned what this says about her mother, Governor Palin. Quote, we've seen so many bad plans about breaching the public-private divide lately. Elizabeth Edwards' book tour, Eliot Spitzer's media blitz. But when a teenager goes out on this kind of mission, you have to wonder where her parents' heads are. What does this say about Sarah Palin's judgment? Now to mixed news on the job front. More than 500,000 people lost jobs last month, hitting a 26-year high of 8.9%. Now here's the good news.
There are some preliminary signs and some other data that the rapid rate of economic decline may be slowing.
Now, that suggests the recession may be bottoming out, and just hours ago, the president talked about plans to keep jobless Americans, help them prepare for new jobs. Let's take a listen to that.
That's what our unemployment system should be, not just a safety net, but a stepping stone to a new future. It should offer folks educational opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have, giving them the measurable and differentiated skills they need, not just to get through hard times, but to get ahead when the economy comes back.
Now, our caucus roundtable today includes Washington correspondent Ed Andrews, Elizabeth Buemiller from the New York Times, the Pentagon correspondent, has not arrived yet. We'll get her in shortly, and White House correspondent Cheryl Stolberg. Let's start with you, Ed. How good were these stress tests yesterday, and how surprisingly less bad were the unemployment numbers than some had expected?
The stress tests yesterday, which tried to measure the basic health of the nation's biggest banks, were better than I think people thought a couple of months ago or even a couple of weeks ago. They basically concluded that the big banks would only need to raise $75 billion in extra capital in order to be able to withstand a possibly severe recession.
So should people feel de-stressed about that?
Well, no, I don't think the banks
Are you feeling stressed about that?
I'm surprised by what passes for good news.
Yeah, like 600,000 jobs lost?
Exactly. And I think maybe Barack Obama should be feeling de-stressed about it because it means he doesn't have to go back to Congress right away and ask for more money to bail out the banks. And that's something that he really can't afford to do right now.
But is he going to have to go back and ask for more stimulus next year, especially if unemployment, as we were talking about with Austin Goolsbee, keeps rising, maybe hits that 10% mark?
Right. Well, that's exactly the problem. It's one thing to have the economy bottoming out and a recovery perhaps starting later this year. It's a whole different order of magnitude to get back to where we were before. The most optimistic analysts, expect that it'll be mid-2010 before the unemployment rate starts really coming down, and it's going to be at a very high level. And the question that Obama has, of course, is can he wait that long before, will the public be patient enough?
Well, let's talk about something he can't wait on, and Cheryl, you wrote about that this week. That is, he needs to choose a new Supreme Court justice.
That's right.
Many people have been watching Barack Obama take a very cautious approach to social issues, and you wrote about that in the New York Times. you had a point there that two of the potential choices for the court on Obama's list are gay. Do you see any chance under the sun that Barack Obama would take the risk of appointing an openly gay jurist to the court?
I think what we're going to see out of President Obama is a jurist who he thinks is the best jurist. And I would suspect that, gay or not, I think he's going to have to make this consideration regardless of the person's sexuality, because he's getting it from both sides, right? If he picks someone who's openly gay, he'll be praised by gay rights advocates, and he'll infuriate the right. He's got to make the case for whoever his nominee is that this is the best and most qualified legal mind for the job, and I really do think that's what we'll see out of him.
Maybe it's because I'm older than you and have covered more campaigns, but it would stun me.
You say no way?
Well, having seen the culture wars develop over the last 4 decades in national politics, having seen Republicans do so well with those issues in presidential election after election, I think it would be stunning if he did that. Can you imagine a new kind of Supreme Court fight over an openly gay justice?
I think that'd be breaking a heck of a barrier, but it's a little hard for me to contemplate. However, I'm not a political analyst. I wouldn't want to call that shot for him.
Right. Now, the growing fight against the Taliban is something else that's become very important in both Afghanistan and Pakistan because it's spilling over the border. Overnight, Pakistan launched a major offensive against the militant safe haven in Swat Valley. That's only 80 miles northwest of the capital of Islamabad. The country's prime minister says the country will not bow before extremists.
To restore honor and dignity of our homeland and to protect our people, the armed forces have been called in to eliminate the militants and terrorists.
Okay, let's bring in now Elizabeth Buemiller, the Pentagon correspondent. Elizabeth, tell me how serious and dangerous this problem is for Barack Obama and whether, in fact, it could become his Iraq quagmire.
It's very serious. You hear much more alarm now from senior officials at the Pentagon and from the White House. What's the real problem is that the Pakistani army. We don't have troops in Pakistan, at least not yet, and they're not really trained to fight in this guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency as we call it here, and they also did not until recently show really the kind of will to take on the Taliban within their own country. Now, this incursion into Bunair district and the Swat Valley has been, as Defense Secretary Bob Gates has said, has been a wake-up call to them, and they are responding. The question is, how long will they respond, and how long can this be sustained? And also the big question is about the survivability of the government of Asif Ali Zardari, the Pakistan president, who was
Elizabeth,
in
terms of U.S. troops, do you see any change in the unwillingness of the United States and the Pakistanis to have U.S. troops on their soil, or is it going to be a continued effort with drones that are unmanned?
Well, right now the Pakistanis will not allow U.S. troops on their soil. That's a done deal. However, we have about 70 to 100 of what we call trainers in the border region working with the Pakistani commandos and their frontier corps. That's what we have so far, and so for right now, yes, we're still relying on the drones, and there is a big push right now to try and get more Pakistani troops trained and to allow more U.S. trainers in Pakistan, but the Pakistanis won't have it. They don't want a big presence of the United States on their soil, so there's negotiations right now about perhaps training these Pakistani trainers outside of Pakistan, perhaps in the U.S., and bringing them back. It's a very
Cheryl,
this is, by the way, a long-term effort.
Cheryl, let me ask you very quickly, because you covered President Bush. Do you see signs that this is going to turn into an involvement that President Obama is going to see dominate his term?
I do. I think this is President Obama's war. Afghanistan is to President Obama as Iraq was to President Bush. He made a decision very early in his presidency to send 17,000 additional troops. Now he's sending more. He takes ownership of this. We've
got to leave it there. Ed Andrews, Cheryl Stolberg, Elizabeth Buemiller, thanks so much for being with us on the caucus. Now, you can see the presidents of Afghanistan and Pakistan this Sunday on Meet the Press with David Gregory. Also coming up, how the homeless are taking on the power brokers of Wall Street. You've got to see this. This is the New York Times special edition on MSNBC. Thanks, Bill. The New York Times has all the news that's fit to print. Here are some stories making headlines right now. First, you know those electronic books that let you read books digitally? Well, they don't always get things right. The Amazon Kindle may need some help with pronunciation of the name of the president. The Kindle mispronounces both Barack and Obama. Amazon CEO says that's unfortunate and had the correct pronunciation of the president's name added to the device. The Obama administration is letting stand a Bush-era rule that limits protection of polar bears from global warming. The rule doesn't use the polar bear's status as a threatened species to limit the production of greenhouse gases outside the bear's Arctic habitat. And a new but familiar crew member is joining Star Trek on the big screen, Carnegie Mellon computer professor Randy Fausch. The Star Trek producers had heard about Fausch's love of Star Trek and offered him a small role in the movie. Fausch, who wrote the best-selling book The Last Lecture, died last July. Now, also in the New York Times today, a story you don't want to miss. A New York team, is the newest member of Street Soccer USA, a 16-city network of homeless soccer teams that started in 2005 and is under the umbrella of Help USA, a homeless services provider. Street Soccer New York comprised many of the people who lost their jobs, matches up against corporate-sponsored teams at New York's Chelsea Piers. It's a huge group effort. A sponsor raised their entry fee, Nike donated their equipment, and Chelsea Piers provided their jerseys. They lost their first few games, but the final score of their last game, homeless 10, bankers 4. Their goal, to make it to the Homeless World Cup, scheduled for this September in Milan. Now, coming up, layoffs don't just hurt the people who lose their jobs, but also the people who have to make those tough decisions. Hear from a woman profiled in the Times who had to make layoff decisions and tell the workers about it. Plus, the Times takes you behind the scenes in the Oval Office next on this special edition, only on MSNBC. And right now on the New York Times website, go behind the scenes to the White House and see exactly what it's like to be a photographer or a reporter covering the president in the Oval Office. You got to hustle to keep up with what's going on at the White House, and everyone wants to get the front row shot. Here you see reporters arriving to cover a meeting between President Obama, Vice President Biden, and Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. You can see a lot more of that on nytimes.com. Now, this just in to hear us here at NBC. The White House has just announced that President Obama will travel to Egypt next month, June 4th, to give a speech to the Muslim world. A day later, the president will travel to Germany to visit the city of Dresden and the Buchenwald concentration camp set up by the Nazis during World War II. Now, over 500,000 Americans lost their jobs last month, and for small business, those layoffs are often very personal. The job of telling employees who've been let off can be painful. Michael Luo is a national correspondent for the New York Times. In his latest article, Michael profiled a woman whose job it is to deliver the bad news to employees. He joins us live from New York. Michael, we see so many headlines about large companies laying off thousands of workers, but we don't often see what happens in the intimate settings of small businesses with numbers of people who've worked at very close range for a long period of time. Tell me what you found about how difficult that process is.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly. I mean, the idea in the story was to find out what really actually happens. That's when you actually have to lay people off. And I actually intentionally looked for small business because I figured it would be a lot more personal at these kinds of places. Obviously, not every boss is close to his workers, but in the case of Shelley Pullum, who was the person I profiled in the story, I mean, she really did seem like the kind of boss who it was like family. That's how she described her workers, and she's had to lay off 26 people in the last couple months, and her company is down to about 50 workers, and it really was a painful process. It took an emotional toll on her.
Michael, where is that company located, and how'd you find it?
Yeah, it's in Grafton, Wisconsin. It's about a half hour north of Milwaukee, and she actually responded to. I put out a bunch of feelers. This is the way I usually do my stories. I go fishing really for regular people. It wasn't on Facebook. It was through one of these services that help reporters out sometimes that I sometimes use, and she happened to have a friend who got the email and passed it on to her as a PR person, I think, or somebody in the media industry, and passed it on to her and thought that she actually should respond. And when
Michael,
she's
let's bring bring in Shelley right now because we've got her on the phone. She's the vice president of administration at that family-owned manufacturing company. Shelley, thanks for being with us. And you talk in Michael's story about the stone-cold face you've got to put on when you're talking to people. Maybe you'll cry later, but when you're with those employees, you've got to be tough. Tell me about how you pull that off.
It's really, when you say stone-cold face, it's a way of, my husband and I express ourselves, it's for me to get in my zone and to block everything out and just focus on what's at hand.
Have you ever lost it when you're dealing with somebody who you've known for a long time, who you've had to lay off, or are you always able to keep it together till you get back by yourself?
I have lost it on occasion here and there, but for the most part, on the floor, I've tried to keep my composure and until I'm by myself.
Tell me, Shelley, how many people has your company had to lay off from your peak employment, and how's the company doing right now?
We have had to lay off 26 employees since October, with the last layoff happening at the end of March. We're struggling. Sales are extremely low, and we're fighting to stay alive.
Do you see any of the signs of economic turnaround that we've heard the president talk about lately?
We've seen a little bit more pickup in our quoting process, which is a sign of hope for us, but just working hard to land those jobs and bring some work in.
Shelley, best of luck to you. Thanks so much for being with us. Now, earlier this hour, we asked you to send in your survival strategies for getting by in this economic downturn. Here's some of the responses that came in. Greg in Spokane, Washington writes, I'm driving less instead of making a trip out for the one item or errand. I wait until I have several things that I need to do. Julia in Baltimore says, we pack our lunches every day. I make my coffee at the office rather than go buy it on the go. We buy our 19-month-olds clothes at Swaps. And from Sue in Texas, if you take sandwiches to work, use the empty cereal bags out of cereal boxes for wrapping them. Michael, what do you think of these? I know you've got a new baby yourself. Are you doing any survival strategies like the ones we just heard?
Well, I just took a 5% pay cut, so I think I'm probably going to have to start doing some of that. Actually, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, even before this pay cut,
as did everybody at the New York Times, by the way.
Exactly, at the New York Times, yeah. I mean, even before this, I kind of feel like psychologically, my wife and I have been doing things a little differently, even if there hasn't been an adjustment in our salary. And actually, I feel like talking to a lot of folks across the country who haven't even lost their jobs or even maybe haven't even taken a pay reduction, they really actually, there's something in their head going on, and they've adjusted their lifestyle as a result. It'll be interesting to see. We're starting to see some better economic news that the job losses are slowing. We're still losing jobs, and companies aren't hiring at the rates we've seen in the past. But it'll be interesting to see if that psychology can get into people's heads and people will actually start spending money again.
Well, Michael, speaking of people's heads, thanks for taking us inside some of the painful problems associated with this recession that we don't often get to see, especially at small companies. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for the New York Times Special Edition here on MSNBC. I'm John Harwood. Next up, Nora O'Donnell picks things up. She'll have the very latest on Drew Peterson in court. The former Chicago cop is accused of killing his third